Hello, my name is Diana Hagan, and it's my honor today to interview U.S. District Court Judge Tena Campbell on behalf of the 10th Circuit Historical Society. Judge Campbell was appointed to the bench in 1995 and has served for just over 16 years. She took senior status 1 year ago. Now let's start with a little bit of background. You grew up in Buell, Idaho, and did you always want to be an attorney?
No, I grew up in a little farming community in Idaho. I think like most people, I had no idea what I wanted to be or what I was going to do. And I started out by becoming a French teacher, and then it was only later that I went to law school.
And did you study French in college then?
I did. I went to the University of Idaho, studied French, and then was lucky enough to spend a year in France. When I counted up my credits at the end of my senior year, realized I had to be a French major because that's what I had the credits in. Started teaching French. Then I went and I had a master's, got a master's at Arizona State. Met my husband Gordon, who was a first-year law student. We moved to San Francisco when he graduated because he had a clerkship with a wonderful guy, wonderful Judge Oliver Kelch, the Ninth Circuit. I couldn't get a job as a teacher there. I became a secretary, and I was an absolutely terrible secretary. Do not have those skills, which are difficult. And when we moved back to Phoenix, I realized I'd have to do something different. So then I went to law school.
And where did you go to law school?
I went to Arizona State for the first 2.5 years. But in the middle of my third and final year, Gordon decided that he wanted to return to Utah. He'd spent some time here working at the Rustler and go skiing, which did cause a problem, being as I was not yet finished with law school, but we were able to arrange it. Took my last few credits at the University of Utah, but graduated from ASU.
What was your first job out of law school?
My first job was with Norm Johnson. He's gone now, but Norm was maybe the greatest mentor anyone could have. And he worked in what's now the Bombara building on Main. And Gordon had seen him in the elevator. That's where Gordon's office was. And Gordon came home one day and said, "There's this big blonde guy I see in the elevator. He's a real nice fellow. Why don't you go ask him for a job?" So I did, and Norm was the head of a small firm, Johnson Durham, that's Christine Durham, Justice Durham, and Moxley, Paul Moxley, who's been president of the Utah State Bar, and Norm hired me. That was my first job, and it was a great job.
What kind of work did you do there?
Well, I did. He was mainly a securities litigation, but what was great about Norm and his firm was long before it was even heard of that there be flexibility for people like me who had a child. Norm just did it. He'd done it for Chris Durham, who had children, and he did it for me. So I got to work half-time. I got to bring my daughter to work. He just thought it was a decent thing to do. And he started me thinking that if I ever had people who worked, I guess, for me, that those were accommodations I was going to give.
And did that firm later become part of Fabian and Clendenin?
Yeah, briefly we merged. And it was when I was at Fabian that I decided I needed to learn how to try cases. So I applied for and I was hired at the county attorney's. And I worked there for about 6 months, and I had a wonderful time at the misdemeanor section. And I drove all over the valley. I tried cases in the basement of not a magistrate, but a justice of the peace in Magna. I went to Tooele. I did drunk driving cases, which are wonderful learning because you have chain of custody and you have expert witnesses. I did dog bite cases. I became a little bit of an expert in that area of your rogue dog. And then I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Brent Ward hired me.
Did your experience with dog bite cases pay off at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
Sadly, yes. I thought when I left county attorneys that my biting days were over. But my very first case, and remember as a new kid, I got everybody's cast-offs. a woman who was accused of biting immigration agents. That was my very first case, and it was before Judge Anderson, Alden Anderson, and so my expertise in the bite area paid off.
What other kinds of cases did you do at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
I was there for 14 years, and I started just doing, everything. It was a small office. We were only about 14 people, as what we are now. You are now. How many do you have now?
50, more than 50, I think.
We were 14 people, and at times I was the only woman. So I was criminal. I did bank robberies and assaults and drug cases and kidnappings, like you, and sex crimes. But about my last 5 years, I did mainly white collar. And when I left, I was head of the bank fraud unit.
Do you have any memorable cases during your time at the U.S. Attorney's Office that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I think all of them were memorable, but one that I think about two the most. One was an assault on, I believe it was the Navajo reservation. I can't remember if it was the Navajo or the Utes. And during what the defendant called just a domestic situation, he set his home on fire and burned his lovely young wife to the point where her arms were amputated at the elbows later. And she was only about 21 years old. And I thought about that one a lot. She ultimately, not directly as a result of that, but later died. She just, without your arms at the elbow and her children, it was just too much. And I thought about that one a lot. And then I had a kidnapping where a man seized a young 18-year-old girl in the parking lot at J.C. Penney's, pushed her into her car, kept her captive for about 5 days, took her across state lines, sexually assaulted her numerous times, frightened her so that she did not run, returned with her, and then there was the prosecution. I think about that, and I've lost touch with her. I was in touch with her for years, but now I wonder what's going on with her and hope all goes well.
Were both of those defendants convicted?
They were. They were.
When you were at the U.S. Attorney's Office, you developed a great reputation for being very meticulous and hardworking and prepared and
the Duchess of Dirt.
That's right, the Duchess of Dirt. Tell us about that nickname.
The Duchess of Dirt. I don't know how. I'm afraid I take pride in that name, and that probably tells you something sick about me. But this happened particularly when I was doing white-collar crimes, and you know how that goes. There is no question about what a defendant did in a white-collar crime. The question always is, what was his? I never had a woman white-collar defendant. What was his intent? And it's very hard to prove intent. In other words, there was usually testimony, very persuasive testimony by the defendant and others that it was just a business deal that went wrong. It was helpful to have past misdeeds on hand and witnesses who had bad experiences with the defendant and had an opinion that he was not honest to testify afterwards. So I always looked for that, and usually I could find it.
That's great. So you sort of pioneered the use of that kind of impeachment evidence in this district.
Well, I don't know pioneered, but I certainly exploited it.
You did have a great reputation as a trial attorney.
Well, thank you.
What kind of lessons did you learn from that experience? Do you have thoughts about what makes a good trial attorney? No, but I had the good fortune to watch a lot of good trial attorneys. My husband, Gordon, who was at times at the U.S. Attorney's Office and then at times in private practice, is, I think, one of the best. He's a natural storyteller, he has great charm, and he worked real hard. And I always watched him. And then when I was in the office, I tried about 7 or 8 cases with Stu Waltz. And you know Stu. Yes.
Have you tried a case with Stu?
I've been trying for years.
Stu Walz is one of the best trial attorneys I know. And as I would watch him, I tried to memorize everything he did. And that, I think, was the main advantage I had, was watching people try cases. Then at the U.S. Attorney's Office, you get to go to school, you know, and 2 weeks of school, and I thought it was very worthwhile.
And you actually taught that trial advocacy course.
In later years, I did. But the first 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, I was always learning. And also I had Bruce Lubeck, you know, and Bruce had tried so many cases, and I would watch him. And I think watching, and I read a lot of stuff, and even now out on the bench I have all these little handbooks about foundations for evidence, and I didn't leave a whole lot to chance. I was pretty aware that I'm not the fastest thinker on my feet, and I would have trial outlines in my trial book with a big square saying, offer exhibit W2, a foundation, not hearsay. So I took the extra steps knowing my weaknesses, and it at times paid off, and at times it did not.
And I remember you telling me that you would have research on issues that might come up, and you would really think through the entire process.
Right. I always tried to write a trial brief. And as I was getting ready for pre-trials, you know, meeting with witnesses, after a while it became very clear to me what questions were going to draw a little fire from the other side, what the objections might be. And I tried to think through and maybe even write a citation in my outline about what case would get over that. Same for the exhibits. Like some are so obviously going to be objected to as hearsay. And it was my experience, and I still see it, many things aren't being offered for the truth. So I tried to figure that out. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully.
Now, you were nominated by President Bill Clinton in 1995.
I was.
How did that come about?
There were no women district judges on our bench, which is a situation that still needs to be changed, but I'll save that for another day. And I remember sitting at the breakfast table, and I was reading that Judge Jenkins was going to go senior. And I, by that time, had been trying cases in the federal court exclusively for 14 years. And I thought, you know, it's about time that a woman got on. And I've been there for 14 years. I might as well give it a try. I've been fortunate enough to meet Senator Hatch. He would always meet the people at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And also I had had a case involving his family. Someone had harassed his family. And so I worked with him a little bit on that. I think that he was satisfied with how it was resolved. We formed a friendship. I found him to be a very sympathetic, nice man. I knew he had a belief that there should be a woman on the bench, and I thought, well, if they need a woman on the bench, I'm their man. So that's what I did.
And how did the confirmation process go?
I was definitely a dark horse. Nobody knew me because, having been in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 14 years, certainly I couldn't be politically active. And I just sort of kept a low profile. There were other people trying for the judgeship who were better known and who I think the bar thought were far more qualified. But Senator Hatch, who was then chairman of the Senate Judiciary, got it in his mind that I might be the one because I'd been trying cases for 14 years and I knew the process. So he pushed aside the objections, and that's what happened.
Well, and I know that you got the highest ranking from the ABA. And did you have any trouble in your confirmation hearings?
With Senator Hatch, the chairman, being my sponsor? No. In fact, it only took 4 days from hearing to when I was ultimately sworn in.
After you were nominated, former U.S. Attorney David Jordan said, Tena is one of the most outstanding prosecutors in the U.S. Justice Department. She's tried dozens of jury trials. She's universally respected by the federal judges. Now, did your experience as a trial attorney in federal court make you better equipped to become a good judge?
I think so, but first I want to talk about David Jordan. I worked for David Jordan when he was U.S. Attorney, and I loved working for David. He helped me through the confirmation process. He was very savvy, he was very supportive, and I seriously think that he and Senator Hatch were the two main reasons I'm sitting here today. Did I find being, I certainly knew the rules of evidence. I had a basic understanding of criminal law, and I had some knowledge of the need to be temperate as a judge. Because I recognized that being a judge, it's the easiest position in the world to be a bully. You know, you can have a bad hair day and sort of grouchy up there, but to the litigants and the attorneys, it just appears that the judge is out for them. And I realized that, so I think maybe those experiences helped me.
So what was it like when you became a judge and joined all those judges that you'd been appearing before for 14 years on the bench?
Well, it was a very nice experience. I think I said when I was sworn in, and I meant it then and I mean it now, that when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, the thing I liked, among the things that I liked the most was I worked with my friends. I loved the people at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Stuart and I had adjoining offices. I was great friends with Brooke Wells. I was good friends with Carly. I loved David Jordan and Dee Benson. I loved those people. And when I went over to the judges and became colleagues with the judges, I found again they were colleagues. And there were several of the judges that I became very close to. Judge Boyce. Judge Boyce, Ronald Boyce, who died now about 7 years ago, he was a mentor. He had helped me a lot when I would appear in front of him. He offered advice. I think during the first 5 years that I was a judge, I was up in his office asking him questions 3 or 4 times a week. And he knew it all. Judge Boyce knew it all. And he was delightful. And if it hadn't been for him, I think I'd have made a lot more errors than I did anyway. Then second, I relied heavily on Judge Winder. I think every new judge coming in relied on Judge Winder. And I said once at his memorial service, he was the go-to guy. I remember it was my first jury selection. And I thought I knew everything there was to know about jury selection. I'd been selecting juries for 14 years. But I'd been doing it from a different perspective, you know, a litigant. And I suddenly realized I had not the faintest idea how to do it as a judge. And so I went, and he said, yeah, Dee asked me the very same questions, Dee Benson. And he went through it with me. And I saw him, I relied on him. My first injunction, I was absolutely terrified. I think it had to do with shutting down a claim that the chemical destruction areas in Tooele should be shut down. And it was, I mean, I was overwhelmed. I'd never done an injunction hearing, and here were these issues. And I really think that it was Judge Campbell, Judge Winder, who did that hearing and who wrote that decision, because he stepped me through it.
Now, during the confirmation process, you told the Senate Judiciary Committee that the hallmark of a fine judge, especially at the trial court level, is the ability to simply apply the law as it exists in a fair, even-handed, and sound manner. Has that remained sort of your motto throughout your judicial experience?
I hope so. It's what I try for. I'm sure, you know, when a hearing is over, when a trial is over, someone always walks out a loser. And that person or those people understandably are a little bit upset with the process. I mean, those stakes are very important in the courtroom. But I do believe firmly, and I think I used to tell you, that my ideal case when I'm solving a problem is when precedent is so clear. the last thing I want to do is blaze new trails. I do not want that. And if I have 10th Circuit precedent or Supreme Court precedent that pretty well tells me what to do, I'm happiest. But that very often is not the case. And as you know, then you have to take the facts and look what has been said in the higher courts and try and figure out how that applies, which gets me onto sort of a pet peeve. Often, and you hear it, you'll hear politicians talking about activist judges. And I'm thinking, an activist judge? What is an activist judge? I think most, if not all judges, and certainly judges on my level, our job is, and we do it, is to try and take a unique set of facts, look at what the law is, and say, what does the law dictate? And that is a phrase that really annoys me. So.
Well, and you've never been results driven. I know as your law clerk, you'd say we apply the law to the facts and the chips fall where they may.
And that's true. Sometimes, I must say, I feel it a little better when the result turns out one way.
Certainly.
Every once in a while it'll turn out and I think, oh, that is truly awful. But, you know, that's not my job. Mm-hmm. That's not my job.
And you have a different view of the district court's job as opposed to like the circuit court or, of course, the Supreme Court. Is that right?
Well, I think as you look at it in the, ultimately, all courts have to look at some higher body of law. The 10th Circuit has to look at what the Supreme Court has said and other circuits. The Supreme Court has to look at what Congress has said and what the Constitution says. So all judges' job is to look at that law as it exists. The appellate courts and, of course, the Supreme Court don't, they have a little, their job is a little broader. Theirs is not as fact-driven. Although my belief is the very best judges on the appellate level and the Supreme Court level are those who have had experience at the district court level, because those judges, when saying what a lower court must do, they realize that some things just don't work, and they have to realize the impossibility of doing some things. And I think most appellate judges do that. Now, I've certainly been reversed in my 16 years. And when it happens, I usually just say, well, that's the way they see it. And it's not particularly annoying. The only time my feathers are ruffled is when I believe they have not, the reviewing court has not given deference to my factual findings, and when the reviewing court has not respected the abuse of discretion in factual findings. Because, and a really good appellate judge is keenly aware, because what is actually happening in the courtroom can seem, it's far different when reviewed on the record, as you know, because
Absolutely.
you've had experience in both, extensive. And so I think an appellate judge who says, well, yeah, she did this, but think about if she hadn't done that, what was going to happen. And that's my thought on the role of an appellate court.
What do you find to be the most difficult part of being a judge?
Well, maybe I'm just getting soft in my old age, but I get no pleasure out of sending people to prison. I particularly don't get pleasure, and I find it terribly difficult to send people to prison, giving them sentences that I believe are too harsh. And that will happen now, since the guidelines are only advisory, but I still have to face mandatory minimums. When I have to send someone to jail, to prison for what truly is a life sentence, and it's my firm belief, even having sat through the trial and having heard about what this person did, and often it's quite bad, I still have I'm usually quite disturbed by what I have to do.
And I know that you love your job, though, overall. What is it that gives you pleasure about doing this job?
Well, you know, I've been one of the lucky ones. And I have had the chance to have, in my career, all my jobs, beginning with Norm Johnson and going through Brent Ward and David Jordan and here. When I have had bosses, I've had great bosses. But most important, I've had people that I worked with whom I adored. And I've worked in this building because when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we were up on the 4th floor. And now I'm here. And every time I open the door to this lovely old courthouse, I'm happy. And I like what I do, but mostly I like who I work with.
That's great. You mentioned the courthouse. Now, when you were chief judge, you took on the project of building the new courthouse, correct?
I took it on before.
Before that?
I took it on, Dee Benson was the chief judge. And Dee Benson, and Dee and I have been friends for 20 years. But Dee, when he built his house, he was building a house himself, and he liked the looks of the neighboring house. So he said to his contractor, I want my house to look just like that one, color and all. And he built it so it resembles it exactly. And then he was somewhat nonplussed. Why were the neighbors disturbed? But he recognized that maybe designing a courthouse, not designing because the architects did that, but maybe working with the courthouse was not his strong point. Although he has been involved, and I've made him and begged him to stay involved because Dee has very good common sense. And I didn't want him to slip out completely because he, as far as the politics and working with Washington and getting some very necessary things done, Dee Benson was the reason. But I took it over about 8 or 9 years ago, and I asked Judge Sam Alba to be co-chair with me, because Sam's a bit of an architect. So now, after about 20 years, our building over there is going to be finished in 2013. And I don't know whether I've just been brainwashed, but I think it's going to be a great building. Now I know that the community is going to, some are going to protest. It's quite modern, but it is the 21st century. But I think it's a great building, and our contractors are going right along. I think we're on, the 9th story now, and we have 10. And according to Jack Benko, our architect, it's being well built, and so I'm excited about it.
That's great. Now, there were a lot of bumps along the road getting the courthouse built.
The bumps came primarily, first of all, the bumps came from a local bar. We couldn't get the land, so we had to condemn all the buildings on this block. We couldn't go across the street because of political reasons. So we had to condemn everything, and there was one bar, the Port of Call, that for a lot of reasons I won't get into, it looked like we were going to have the entire block but for the Port of Call. And then the Port of Call said, well, you really have, in essence, taken our land, taken our building, you should pay us for it. Well, money was such an issue anyway. And I remember receiving a call from the attorney who represented the Port of Call and saying, if you don't buy this, we're going to sell it to a strip club. And I said, good. Many of us need a second job. Go ahead, do it. But that was when Dee Benson stepped in. And he wrote a letter to Congress and the GSA saying, if you build this courthouse, and we have the Port of Call there, we won't move in. And that was exactly what he had to say. Mm-hmm. And he had the courage and the political skills to do it. We came to a grinding halt for a couple of years. Then we started again. We had to fashion everything. And we moved over, so now we face West Temple and 4th South. We moved completely.
Mm.
So those were the bumps.
And the Oddfellows Hall building.
Oh, the Oddfellows. Yeah, the Oddfellows. My big dream had been, and maybe it was based on my experience, I had such luck being able to bring my daughter to work, and I wanted to turn the Oddfellows into a daycare, or at least have some daycare, and I thought that would be an ideal building. But that hasn't worked out, although now we have land there, and I still have a hope that down the road, when money is better, we can build one there. We had to move it to a cost finally of $6 million. And as you've seen they rolled it across the street. And that was an ordeal, but we think about it now, and I think we all think it's kind of funny.
Now, you were chief judge for 7 years, is that right?
No, I could have been for 7 years, but I wanted to go senior.
Oh, that's right.
So I became senior a year ago, and then Judge Stewart became chief.
And did you enjoy being chief judge?
Well, there were certain things I liked about it. I got a 3rd clerk. That was wonderful. I got to be a little bit in on all the gossip of what was going on, and I really didn't have much to do because Mark Jones and Louise York are so good as the clerk and deputy clerk that I didn't have anything to do except, sign checks and say, okay, that sounds fine, and enjoy my 3rd clerk. So yeah, it was fun.
Good.
A lot of fun.
We talked about, we mentioned that you were the first woman
Yes.
who was appointed to
And
the
still
district court.
still the only one. It looks like it's going to remain that way.
And does that surprise you, that we're here 16 years later and you're still the only woman who's been appointed?
Yeah, it does surprise me. It disappoints me. There was some sort of ceremonial gathering a few weeks ago. I think it was the swearing in of David Barlow, the U.S. Attorney, and I couldn't go. And I had several people say to me, it just looks funny to see all those white men, all of whom I adore, but they are all white men, because it doesn't look like the bar. I mean, the bar, they're 50% women, they're minorities. I think the judiciary should reflect what the bar looks like, and I'm not understanding why it doesn't. We've got some wonderful women out there who would make great judges, and I was really hoping that my replacement would be a woman, but it doesn't look like it's going to be. So I don't know what's up.
In 2007, you received or were named Woman of the Year by the Women Lawyers of Utah.
I think you were the one, you were involved in that.
I was one of your nominators, absolutely.
Thank you.
But it was due in large part to the way you've mentored young women lawyers like me, and your advocacy for women in the profession and on the bench. How important do you think it is for judges and more seasoned women lawyers to support other women in the profession?
Well, I think it's very important. I think the best thing I do as a judge, I mean, my greatest skill is I choose great clerks. I've had over 30 now. I've kind of lost count. And they are, when I look around the community, I look at you, what you are. You're head of the appellate division, and yet you're still able to work some from home. You've been able to raise your kids, you and Tobin. I think that's wonderful. So I think it's very important that judges like me act as mentors to many young people, male and female. Yes. But it does seem, as I think back, that I have a little bit more interest in people who are raising children, because that can be tough. That can be tough, and if I hadn't gotten the breaks that Norm Johnson gave me, that Brent Ward gave me, it would have been a far different story.
And you mentioned earlier that you've tried to provide those same sorts of arrangements for your clerks, and
right.
have helped many people like me try to work into an arrangement like that where you can balance work and family.
I was always, when I worked for Brent Ward, my daughter was little, and she was going, I think, to first, second grade. And you know how parents swap, and one takes the kids to school and one brings them home, and she would be dropped off at the courthouse. She would come up to the 4th floor. Brent was fine with it. She'd go into the snack room, she'd eat her snack, she'd come into my office, she'd stretch out on the couch, take a nap, although she knew this was back in the days when, in a criminal case, getting ready for trial, when I was interviewing people in custody, they would simply be handcuffed to a chair with marshals. She knew that when she saw the marshals, she didn't come in. She's told me later that the people handcuffed to the chair didn't scare her, but the marshals always did. But I always felt really good when I saw she was here with me and safe, and I could work better. And I think that's true. That that's why I want that daycare. When parents have a good, safe, healthy environment for their children, they can get their work done better. And I strongly believe in that.
Now, going back to your years as a judge, what have you learned over the years about judging and what makes a good judge? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, you know, I've been a judge now for 16 years, and I'm senior. And I'm going to call it a day one of these days. I don't quite know when, but I certainly want to do it before, you know, I'm led off the bench. So I'm strongly aware that it's coming to an end, which is, in a way, I think it's a bit of a pity, because I believe I'm a better judge now by far than when I began, because I think I have learned that to be a judge, it is so much a matter of temperament. Now, I always was aware, as I told you earlier, that a judge has to avoid being a bully, that a judge has to be respectful, but sometimes that isn't easy to do. I think through the years I have ground it into myself enough that I hope, I'm sure there are people who disagree, treating people with respect, trying not to show frustration, being very careful not to let what's going on within me, like, you know, I've had a bad day, don't push it on, that it's become easier. And that's so important. I can do that now much easier. And that comes at a time when I'm winding down.
Any other thoughts about being a judge or the judiciary that you'd like to share?
No, not really, except I've had a wonderful time. And I'm very, very proud of being a judge. I'm proud of the judiciary. Sometimes when I hear people in other branches of government say something like arrest judges or do this to the judges, etc., I think you can't be serious, because the three branches, I mean, I've come to appreciate how important all three are with this kind of balance that we have. And at times, in the last years, and when I read in history, like certainly segregation and on through, it seems like judges have done wonders in our country. Very, very brave. I went to the Holocaust Museum as part of a judge outing some years ago, and we were receiving a series of lectures on the role of judges during the Holocaust. And the judges in Nazi Germany gave up their independence. They signed on and endorsed what was happening in the Nazi regime. And I thought, oh my. And I was just so proud that our judiciary is independent. And so it's been a good time, and one that I'm proud of.
That's great.
And thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Judge. Now there's a great story about this picture.
Oh, yeah. As you can see, if you look in on that picture, I was sitting here doing jury instructions in a case, and there was a young attorney who was nervous, and I understand that. I was always nervous. In fact, I still am nervous sometimes, but this young attorney, I guess, wanted to kind of hit some common ground with me and said, "Judge, that's a great picture. That's you skiing, isn't it?" And if you look close, I said, "Yeah, that was back in the day when I wore a beard." Because you can see that's my husband, who's 6'4", 220 pounds, and wears a heavy beard. But
And then I recall you adding, "I shave it off for the spring."
yeah, I shave it off for the spring.
And this is your
Oh
husband's
yeah,
book.
I gotta have this. My husband wrote a best-selling mystery called Missing Witness, and he is an attorney, and he worked with the attorney who did Miranda, John Flynn. And this story, although very much fiction, kind of takes little bits and pieces of his experiences working with that attorney. And he's working on a second book.
Wow.
So, my clerks and staff gave this to me July 1995 when I was sworn in, to July 2000. That would be 5 years. Congratulations, 5 years without impeachment. Shoes, which I quite like, and without impeachment, I think speaks for itself. It's a bit frivolous, but again,
Yeah.
so am I.
And a ruby slipper.
And a ruby slipper. And this is my pen collection. And this is probably the only thing resembling an inheritance that I'm going to leave to my daughter. I've been collecting pens since I worked back as a secretary in San Francisco. This was the first pen that I bought. It was a Mont Blanc. And I bought it for $40. They now go for close to $400. And back then, $40, I mean, I agonized, and I bought it on layaway. I put $10 down. It took me 4 months to get the thing out of hock. And then, since then, I've kind of gone wild. And now I guess I might have to stop because I'm just about out of room. This is my latest. My hands are always covered in turquoise or red or green ink. It's just a mess. But if I'm going out to take notes, and I know that it's going to be a really difficult hearing, for some reason it just lifts my spirits if I can take something. You know, I'll look at something and I'll say, this seems like kind of a red day. Maybe I'll use a little red ink, or this one, my origami one, you know, a little weighty. I'm going to do something very important.
And one of the first things we learned as law clerks was do not use the fountain pens.
Right.
Only because they adjust to your writing style, correct?
Right. Sometimes I'll have signed something and a person will say, for an example, an agent needs to sign an affidavit, and she or he'll reach out for it, and I'll say, oh, no, no, I don't think so.
So, Judge, is this a picture of your confirmation?
Right, that's me
when you
being
were-
sworn in. My hair was a bit different. Just like President Obama, I have gone quite gray in the job. But that was me about 16 and a half years ago in August. That's me at the Senate Judiciary Committee with Senator Bennett, whom I admire a great deal, and Senator Hatch, who has been a real champion.
Now, everyone who comes into your chambers notices your Mick Jagger clock.
Yeah, I've had that Mick Jagger clock for about 30 years. And you can tell Mick is in his 70s touring outfit. I can't imagine why, but I was able to buy it for $12 cheap, I guess. The person who sold it to me didn't realize what a gem it is.
Here that you'd like to talk
Here
about.
I am at Baby Judge. You know, that's the school we go to when we're just learning. This is the class. Here is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're in the U.S. Supreme Court Library. These are my fellow judges from that class of '95. And here is when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, all the signatures of the people I worked with. So I've always had that. I bought these bobbleheads for, I think I bought them on Amazon, the Rolling Stones, and then I guess a little bit of wish fulfillment. I added myself
That's great.
as the lead singer right next to Mick, and with Keith and Ronnie and behind me, Charlie, of course, gazing at me admiringly.
Is this your appointment to the bench?
Yes. It's signed by President Clinton, and here is my advice and consent document, and a letter from Janet Reno, which I got for some reason, I don't know why.
Do you remember when you learned that you had received the appointment?
Yes.
Who notified you?
It used to be, and I was really hoping, it used to be that the president himself would call. So I was just waiting for President Clinton to call me. But no, I got a fax. Still, I was glad to get a fax. And I was in the U.S. Attorney's office, and I remember we kind of shut down business, and everybody was having a good time in the hall.
Oh, I bet.
It was a good time.
I bet everyone was very excited.